Another Trump story that's interesting in terms of his endorsement saga that you've been looking at.
Yeah, so the Trump team is in disarray right now. So let's put this up there from Axios, which is because he endorsed a candidate in the special election for the Texas 6th District, which has ended up losing. And this is very important because the candidate he endorsed, Susan Wright, came in a Republican runoff with Jake Ellzey. And the thing is that for a long time, people have been very afraid of having Trump's endorsement of their opponent. Obviously, we see that in the case of Liz Cheney. We see that in the case of Lisa Murkowski. But this is the first time in a while that Trump has actually endorsed somebody who ended up losing the primary in a special election. And I think the reason why this is so significant is because there are a number of cases across the country where this is about to be put to the test in a much bigger way. Now, look, it's a special election, but at the same time, it's Texas, right? Texas 6th District, this is a hard Republican district. And within the story, you can see a lot of Trump allies blaming the Club for Growth president, David McIntosh. But Trump wasn't just silent here. He didn't just endorse somebody. He really kind of went out of his way. He held like a special town hall the night before for her. So he took, time out of his schedule. His PAC.
His PAC put in $100K
right,
down
so like
the stretch when they realized she might be in trouble.
This is really not a joke in terms of the institutional support that he gave, and he ended up losing. So what they describe as the aura of invincibility, which actually is pretty important for Trump in a lot of these primaries, I think it is. There's a lot of people here in D.C. who are going to take notice of the fact that it didn't come through. Now, look, I don't want people to take this like he's losing control or whatever. Right. He's the most popular Republican in the country by a country mile. But remember that even just a little bit of the aura of invincibility shedding could actually open up kind of a new space. I don't think it's going to look like Never Trump or whatever, but I do think that his inability in order to win maybe 3 or 4 or 5 different special elections, that would actually change the calculus of people and their behavior here in Washington and the way that they, interact with Trump or like how much they kiss his ass in public and more, which actually would drive him crazy if he doesn't think that he has control like that.
So I've got one big caveat on this race and then a couple of other indications that maybe his lock grip on the party. Again, I don't want to overstate these things, but there's a couple of little question marks here. So the caveat on this particular race is it was a special election, as you point out. There was an initial vote with like 30 candidates or whatever. And the top 2 out of that, because nobody came out with 50%, the top 2 were both Republicans. So this wasn't actually a Republican primary vote. This was the special election. And so what that means is that this district was not an overwhelming Trump district. I think he won it by maybe 6 points or something. I'm making that up, but it's somewhere in that realm of margin, okay? So in this race, Democrats and independents could also vote, rather. So there's one theory of the case is that because his candidate, was leaning really hard into I'm the Trump candidate. He's recording robocalls and PAC money's flowing in and the ads that she was running were all about like, Trump is with me, et cetera, et cetera. That may have actually hardened the Democrat and independent vote.
Who came out to come vote for him.
Who came out for the other dude. Who ended up ultimately winning by about 6 points. I think that's an important caveat of the dynamics of this race and why it's a little different than if you just have like a Republican primary head-to-head. There's an Ohio race coming up, I believe, next week.
Yeah, that's right.
That's another significant one that he endorsed in, so we'll see what the results are for that one and whether he comes out on top there. However, there were 2 other things that I thought were noteworthy. First of all, Trump came out vociferously against this infrastructure deal that just passed a key procedural hurdle last night in the Senate that we were telling you about, and that Mitch McConnell supported, that a lot of Republicans came on board and supported. Trump put out this statement saying, it's hard to believe our Senate Republicans are dealing with the radical left Democrats and making a so-called bipartisan bill on infrastructure with our negotiators headed up by super rhino Mitt Romney. This will be a victory for the Biden administration and Democrats and will be heavily used in the 2022 election. It is a loser for the USA, a terrible deal, makes the Republicans look weak, foolish, and dumb. It should not be done. Pretty unequivocal there, and yet a lot of Republicans bucked what he wanted them to do and went and voted for it Anyway, so that's interesting.
That's a good point.
The other thing that was noteworthy to me is that Newsmax, which really billed itself as like the preeminent Trump channel, and we covered, and they got a lot of attention when on like one night they beat Fox News during all the Stop the Steal madness. Of course, Fox, you know, they took a lot of heat from the conservative base because they called Arizona, and they were less like all in on the Stop the Steal stuff. So Newsmax gained a lot of ground during that interim time before Biden was inaugurated. Well, since January, they've lost half of their audience, and they still leaned into this strategy of taking all the Trump speeches, all the Trump rallies, et cetera, et cetera. It's just not paying dividends like it used to. So that's another sign, and we've covered others, of how the internet traffic and searches for him, et cetera, have gone way down. So those are some interesting other pieces to add to the mix of where he stands in terms of both the Republican Party, but sort of the public writ large.
So that's important, because a Trump which controls 70% of the GOP is different than a Trump that controls 90% of the GOP.
Yes.
Or 95% of the GOP. I think at one point, whenever he was running, he had like 90-something% approval rating within the Republican Party. So diminished, even though you can have like the super majority who support you, having some who are willing to buck the trend, that does actually change some of the calculus, at least in the way that the lawmakers are going to behave here in DC. And then the same thing is true in terms of public interest. So if it is the case that Democrats and independents came out specifically to spite him, it shows that the 2020 effect of we hate Trump, we will do anything in order to screw this guy over, as in voting for Biden, still holds true, which would mean that, yes, if you're in a red state, it's great to be endorsed by Trump. But if you're in any sort of battleground state, stay the hell away.
Yeah.
As I understand it, what's his name? Glenn Youngkin, who is running for governor. He's like, get the hell out of here, Mr. President.
And Terry McAuliffe,
is
the Democrat,
bashing him over the head with
all
it
his
every
ads
day.
are like, he's Trump, he's with Trump. You don't want to vote for Trump in Virginia. So, I mean, that is very revealing.
Yeah.
That's very revealing.
Right, so Glenn Youngkin basically is getting Trump's endorsement, and from all the inside reporting, he's like, dude, I don't want this. I don't want you talking about me. Pretend I don't exist.
Leave me alone.
You know, leave me alone. Trump, of course, can't help himself. He's like inserting himself. And Glenn Youngkin can't publicly say, oh, you know, I don't want his endorsement or whatever, because then he wouldn't get the base to come out. But Terry McAuliffe, who's running against Glenn, is hitting this guy over the head every day. Trumpkin, you know, all the time, at least from what I have observed within the race.
Yeah.
And I'm like, oh, so this, you know, Glenn Youngkin will probably lose by a decent amount. And a lot of these Northern Virginia Democrats are going to come out and be like, screw Trump. That's like a, you know, screw.
That's a big motivator.
It's a big motivator for a lot of these people. So I just think that this is a very revealing insight, not only to his power within the Republican Party, but how and his ability to inspire both hatred and love from different parts of the electorate. It's the Trump effect in politics. Like, this is really what it looks like.
Totally polarized. And like, I'm not a big Terry McAuliffe fan. But he's a pretty savvy politician.
I'd do the same thing if I was running.
He was a pretty popular governor. Previously, it would be a huge upset at this point if Youngkin was to win in Virginia, but I don't think anyone should take anything for granted at this point, because I do think Republicans have a lot of momentum right now. I do think the midterms are going to be really tough for Democrats, just because of history, and I also just think there's more energy and more fury and more all of those things that turn people out to vote in midterm elections. Over on the Republican side, Democrats have, you know, a bad sort of situation or landscape in terms of the way districts have been gerrymandered. So Virginia, always the first canary in the coal mine of what the trends are likely to be in those midterm elections. When it was just after Obama was elected in 2009, Bob McDonnell beats Creed Deeds, the Democrat, and it wasn't even close.
I remember that. That was great.
Back then. And then you have, you know, shift to Terry McAuliffe, and then you get Ralph Northam, two Democrats, and that sort of solidifies Virginia's relatively blue status as dominated by the Northern Virginia suburbs. So definitely want to keep your eye on. Hey guys, thanks so much for watching.
That's right. Just as a reminder, you can become a premium subscriber today. Watch the full show completely uncut. Our reactions to each other's monologues. You get to listen to it. You get to ask us questions. All that good stuff. Link is right there in the description or at breakingpoints.com.
Best of all, great way to say screw you to the mainstream media.